Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak on the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Amendment Independent Expert Scientific Committee on Coal Seam Gas and Large Coal Mining Development Bill 2012. While the Greens will be supporting this bill because it does take us some small way towards addressing the huge problems with coal seam gas and large coal mines, we think it's far too little too late. The Greens have long raised the well-founded concerns of the Australian community about the risks coal seam gas and coal mining pose to our groundwater resources, to our climate, to our good quality agricultural land, to our regional communities across Australia and to our environment, particularly the Great Barrier Reef with massive dredging for export. The coal seam gas and coal mining industries are rapidly expanding across Australia's rich farming regions, which we have in short supply, particularly in my home state of Queensland. They are eating up the landscape, and we're seeing the industrialisation of rural Australia. Our good quality food producing land and its ability to feed us and the world, because we remain net food exporters and should continue to be, and the groundwater and the productivity that land depends on are so precious that they should be off limits to big mines and to coal seam gas. That's the Greens' position, which I've raised many times in this chamber. We're backed by expert bodies like the CSIRO and the National Water Commission, who still don't know what the long-term and cumulative threats posed by these industries are, particularly to our water resources and to the climate, but also more broadly to our environment and communities. Now, this is, of course, despite claims from APPEA last week that CSIRO had backed coal seam gas and said it was safe for groundwater. Of course, CSIRO came out and said, no way, that's not what we said at all. We still don't know what the long-term risks are. And yet, approvals have been issued by both state and federal governments without the understanding of those long-term impacts. Veil the precautionary principle. It's been sacrificed for short-term private profits, for some small amount of royalties, and for the promise of jobs, which never eventuate in the orders of magnitude promised by the big miners, or which are simply fly-in, fly-out or drive-in, drive-out workers that simply drive up the cost of living for locals and destroy families. We just don't know if CSG is safe for our land and water when we lack that information about its long-term impacts, and when the government has done very little of its own research, the Namoy catchment study being one welcome exception to that, and when the government simply relies on the so-called evidence of the miners themselves. But look at the scoreboard. Urban and rural Australians are worried about our land, our water, our climate and the reef, and they've been shocked at the recent rash of disasters associated with the expanding coal seam gas industry. There's been gas bubbling up through the Condamine riverbed close to CSG mining operations in recent months. There was, of course, contamination of the Springbok aquifer in Queensland in 2009, a very worrying occurrence. There was release of CSG polluted wastewater during the 2011 floods in Queensland. And of course there was a gas well blowout and drilling fluid leak near Chinchilla, on top of the recent spill disaster in New South Wales' Pilliga Forest. Much more needs to be done to rein in the unbridled acceleration of these fossil fuel industries. So, Ms Acting Deputy President, the Greens generally support this bill, but it needs to be given teeth, and much more needs to be done to investigate and properly regulate this industry before any more approvals are hastily granted. The Greens will continue to push for far better oversight and management of these industries, for the future of Australian communities and for our generations to come. Despite the lack of information about long-term impacts on coal seam gas, Australian farmers still have no right to say no to coal seam gas mining on their land. Now, I've introduced a bill to allow farmers to choose if they want CSG on their property, given the huge uncertainties about its long-term risks to their land, and it was Tony Abbott's idea originally, but unfortunately the next day he changed his mind. What a tragic shame. Earlier, in fact a couple of weeks ago now, the latest community in the Darling Downs in Queensland faced the invasion of their land from coal seam gas. Cecil Plains, with some of the best soil on the Downs, is being invaded by Arrow Energy's exploratory drill rigs, the fourth of the big CSG miners with mega projects in Queensland. Now, that community was going to blockade, and thankfully the company have now deferred their plans, but for how long we don't know. But blockading is pretty unusual in rural communities, just like the Country Women's Association, who protested for the first time in their 90-year history recently against coal seam gas. This threat to people's farmland and the security and cleanliness of their water supply is really mobilising people. Those farmers on the rich Cecil Plains, many of whom are generational family farmers, are the latest in a long list of communities who are banding together, protesting and blockading against the cowboy, bullying and divisive tactics of CSG companies to force their way onto their farmland. That forcing is completely legal. The farmers cannot say no. They can't refuse entry. My bill to give them that right is desperately needed, and I want to take this opportunity to commend and pay tribute to Lock the Gate Alliance, both the organisation and its members, and all of those farmers and city folk too who've banded together against the might of coal and coal seam gas giants. More power to their arms. I've twice moved in this place for a moratorium on coal seam gas until we understand more about the risks of this industry. Sadly, the two big parties sided with the big miners and ignored the community. And when I moved a motion reflecting the first few paragraphs of the National's own policy on coal seam gas, they didn't come into the chamber to vote and back their own policy, which wisely had called for land and water to be safe. I've also proposed a nationwide Senate inquiry into coal seam gas to get the whole picture of the true environmental, coastal, economic and social impacts of coal seam gas across the whole country. We did look at CSG in the Murray-Darling, and I had the pleasure of sitting in on that Rural and Regional Affairs Committee for that inquiry, but CSG is going to go everywhere. Of course, it's shale gas in WA, and we didn't get the chance to properly consider the marine impacts of exporting most of that gas and the port expansions that entails, let alone the pressure on household gas prices from limiting domestic supply. Lastly, the Greens have been calling for independent Australian studies of the life cycle carbon emissions of coal seam gas. There are none currently. So there's no proof that this so-called transition fuel is any more climate-friendly than coal. Let's be clear, now is not the time to be opening up yet another fossil fuel industry. That's why the Greens have been calling for independent Australian studies into the life cycle carbon emissions of coal seam gas and better monitoring of fugitive emissions from leaking gas wells and pipes. So we welcome this bill as a first step towards better protecting our water resources from the risks posed by large coal mining and coal seam gas. The bill, which sets up an independent scientific expert panel to advise on the risks associated with coal seam gas and coal mining projects, recognises that there are serious gaps in the science about the potential threats posed by these industries. And we acknowledge the significant reform that Mr Windsor has achieved in securing the government's commitment to this bill, and recognise that this is an issue of utmost importance to his region, but which is shared by so many rural communities across eastern Australia. This bill is an improvement on the current state of affairs, where major mining developments are being considered for approval in our prime natural and agricultural areas without being underpinned by adequate and independent science about the risks involved, but it's toothless. What this bill does is set up under our federal environmental laws a committee which can advise governments, but only state governments can act on the advice. And even then, under the funding agreement that they get 50 grand for, they only have to consider the advice of this committee. Now, as a former environmental lawyer, I've seen the weakness of mere consideration. Decision makers can consider information and then totally disagree with or disregard it. And what recourse does the federal government then have if state governments choose private profit over the well-being of our groundwater-dependent communities, industries or the environment? The answer appears to be nothing at all. Unlike other issues regulated by the Federal Environment Act, the Federal Minister won't be able to call in a project and review the decision because the Federal Minister has very limited remit to consider water issues. Which brings me to the key problem that we have with this bill, and that's the fact that there is no point setting up an advisory body on water issues when the Minister has no power to act on water impacts under our environmental laws as they currently stand. As people may know, our federal environmental laws are like a silo, so the Federal Minister can consider only the impacts that are listed in one of those silos, like threatened species or World Heritage Areas or Ramsar wetlands and a few others. Water is not on that list. And water, its depletion, its contamination, is the key problem that communities and the Greens have with coal seam gas. So while the Federal Minister has this great expert panel, he or she will only be able to consider their advice in really quite narrow circumstances, where, for example, national threatened species will be impacted. Now that's fine where there's a groundwater-dependent threatened species, as there is in Queensland, which was why the Minister could impose conditions on water for the big three Queensland CSG projects in the first place. But there won't always be a groundwater-dependent threatened species on that threatened species list that will allow the Federal Minister to properly consider the water impacts of mines and coal seam gas. the minister needs powers to consider water in and of itself. Without that, despite the existence of this new committee, the federal minister won't be able to stop projects where the science indicates that there are broad risks to our communities or to our water systems and to the environment from these proposals. Those responsibilities will stay with the state governments. Now, given the state's track record, we think it's high time that the federal government stepped in to manage the major risks posed by these industries to our ground and surface water. To this end, I've introduced a separate bill to protect water from coal seam gas mining, which would add the impacts of mining on water to our environmental laws as a matter of national environmental significance. We'll continue to push for the federal government to step up, and we hope to secure support for this bill in the Senate in coming months. But the Senate inquiry into that bill recommended that it not be passed, which unfortunately shows me that the government and the opposition are really not interested in the federal government playing a proper role to regulate coal seam gas or to refuse it, let alone condition it to try and protect land and water. And of course there are some exceptions. I might mention Senator Bill Heffernan, who of course is opposed to coal seam gas for all of the same reasons the Greens are. We have an information gap about CSG in particular, and I've already cited concerns of learned bodies like the National Water Commission and the CSIRO. So it is great that this committee will lead a research program, albeit mostly at the behest of the minister, with only a handful of matters that the committee can of their own volition investigate. But without the ability of the federal minister to actually act on that advice and protect our water resources, I'm afraid this bill is simply greenwash. The government wanted to get the MRRT through and thought it would be nice to look like it was doing something on coal seam gas, but this is such a small step forward and sadly falls so far short of what our land, water and communities deserve. So I hope that the government and the opposition seriously consider the amendments that I'll be moving to this bill when we come to committee, and also reconsider their position on supporting my water bill. I want to touch a little on the substance of those amendments now. The first is a moratorium on any more coal seam gas approvals until the committee does the scientific work that it's being set up to do. Surely anything less makes a mockery of the work program of the committee. There seems little point in undertaking research unless it will actually inform decisions on whether new coal mines and coal seam gas mines should go ahead. Now, I understand from the responses to questions I asked in Senate estimates that the research program of this new panel is likely to take about 5 years to complete. And yet, in the meantime, the federal and state governments are proposing to roll ahead with assessing and approving these developments before that science is in. Now, this is of particular concern when it comes to CSG, where we consider the greatest risks and uncertainties lie. So my amendment proposes a 5-year moratorium on coal seam gas to give the committee time to complete its full research program before any more coal seam gas approvals are issued, to make sure their work can count. The government foolishly keeps issuing approvals before we have the full scientific picture before us. We need that 5-year moratorium while that science is being done. Now, Mr Bant, our member for Melbourne, proposed this amendment in the lower house, and sadly it was not supported. Once again, all of the old parties voted it down and backed the big miners over the community and the environment. It's of great concern that the old parties continue to ignore the legitimate concerns of the community and water experts like the CSIRO and the National Water Commission. Now, the Greens are not alone here. Rather, we're speaking for the many Australian communities that have spoken out so strongly against coal seam gas, with a recent poll indicating that 68% of people wanted a moratorium on coal seam gas until it's been proven safe. So I look forward to representative democracy working and that will of the majority of people be reflected in this chamber when it comes to a vote on that amendment. I'll also move amendments to improve the transparency and independence of this committee. Firstly, to ensure that all advice from the expert panel is published online at the time that it is presented to the state or the federal government decision maker. Now, this gives the public the chance to see that expert advice and to urge decision makers to take evidence-based decisions, and will thus improve the quality of decisions made. We believe the community has a right to know what our decision makers know about the risks posed by major coal and CSG projects when making approval decisions. The second tranche of amendments goes to conflict of interest of the committee members, which is of utmost importance in a committee that is entitled independent. Genuine independence, as well as the appearance of independence, is crucial, both to community confidence in this new committee and to its provision of unbiased advice. Currently, the Act, the regs and the bill require that members of the committee disclose any potential conflict of interest at a meeting. Minutes are taken, and under a policy decision, not a statutory one, they're published online. But the conflict disclosures are in the minutes appendices, which are not online. So this is why this amendment is needed, so that the public can have the opportunity to scrutinise such conflicts and check whether they're being properly managed. We believe the community has a right to know whether the experts panel advice is free from any undue influence. I would urge the government, when appointing members of this new committee, to consider carefully the balance between field expertise but not appointing people who are currently on the payroll of the mining and CSG industry. Some members of the interim committee have received substantial research funding from the industry. And while they wouldn't have to do this if the government properly funded research and development in our tertiary institutions, such links do undermine public confidence in the independence of advice provided to government by that committee. I have some other amendments which enhance the independence of the committee, both from industry and from government, including providing that committee members have security of tenure for a minimum of 3 years and that they have adequate support to do their job properly, and allowing the committee, importantly, to conduct research and investigations of their own volition, not just when directed by government. The last tranche of my amendments are about the health impacts of coal mining and coal seam gas. Now, many communities are already experiencing health impacts from large coal mines and the air pollution that they generate. And many Australians, including medical bodies which gave evidence to the Senate inquiry into this bill, have significant concerns about the potential health impacts associated with coal seam gas mining. Now, in the lower house, amendments were proposed to explicitly list areas of expertise that should be represented on the committee, and these included geologists and hydrologists and ecologists, but no human health experts. It is imperative that the health impacts of coal seam gas are considered by this committee, given the chemical cocktails that are pumped into coal seams in fracking fluids and the naturally occurring carcinogenic BTEX, that's benzene, toluene, ethylene and xylene, that can be mobilised by that fracking process, which could end up in drinking water if connections between aquifers are made. Now, we believe this is simply an oversight in not having the health experts on the scientific panel, and that oversight clearly needs to be corrected. So we look forward to the support from both sides of the chamber to ensure that this committee can consider the important health impacts of coal and coal seam gas mining. So in conclusion, as Acting Deputy President, I hope that the Senate concerns itself much more with coal seam gas in the years to come, and in the more immediate future with the amendments that I've proposed. I want to note for any listeners or avid readers of Hansard that I'm disappointed that the government, on my last check, has not provided any speakers to support this bill, bar the obligatory opening and closing speakers. I note that there's only a handful, 2 at last count, of Liberals that are speaking on it too. I think communities concerned about coal and coal seam gas will be disappointed that the 2 old parties are not taking this issue seriously enough to speak on this bill, and in doing so to reflect upon the impact of coal seam gas on their constituents. And I ideally hope that this doesn't signify a continuation of the situation where only the Greens are prepared to stand up for rural communities to protect our precious farmland and water from the voracious coal and coal seam gas industries. We'd really like some company. Thank you.